Wonderful. There she was. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Hurst, for the introduction and for having me here today. Hello, everyone. My name is Rebekah Diane Love. I'm an academic librarian and graduate student, currently working on a second master's degree in English language and literature. My research interests concentrate on Victorian literature, particularly sensation and Gothic fiction, and narrative theory with an emphasis on rhetorical and ethical construction, narrative voice, and metafictive aspects within storytelling. Today, I'll be applying those lenses to one of my favorite novels, A Study in Scarlet. My goal is to guide you through a close examination of Scarlet's rhetoric and use that framing to offer a queer reading of the material that challenges traditional assumptions of what the Holmes stories are ultimately about. To do that, we will be primarily analyzing the narrator and diegetic author of Scarlet and all but 4 entries of the Holmes canon, Dr. John H. Watson. On my slide here, I describe this as a Watsonian reading, and it is Watsonian in the sense that we will be examining Scarlet first and foremost as a work created by John Watson. But if you're familiar with the usual definitions of the terms Watsonian and Doyleist, this falls a bit outside of that framework. I'm not trying to sidestep Doyle's role as the creator of the Holmes canon. Rather, I think it's very likely that Doyle has purposefully created a self-conscious narrator, or a narrator who is aware he has an audience, and is using that premise to comment on the nature of publicity and the dangers that come with telling certain stories at the time in which he was writing. To fully explore that idea, we must pay careful attention to Dr. Watson, a task made more difficult by the fact that as a narrator, Watson is making every effort to have you turn your attention anywhere else. Because this reading is pretty far removed from how many of us are used to approaching the Holmes canon, rather than diving straight into a world of elaborate metafiction and dark Gothic mirrors, I plan to start us off by focusing on small details demonstrating some of Watson's quirks and biases as a narrator, and build towards the headier aspects of this reading towards the latter half of this talk. Then I will leave off with a few ways this reading transforms the Holmes canon beyond this point. So I'm assuming most of us have at least a passing familiarity with A Study in Scarlet, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, A Study in Scarlet, written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was published in 1887 in Beeton's Christmas Annual and is the first entry in the Holmes canon. It is not Holmes's first case, but it is Watson's first time accompanying him, and is consequently also the first entry Watson publishes after a 6-year delay between 1881 and 1887. Put a pin in that wait, it will be important later. For those expecting a rigid adherence to Victorian norms, Scarlet has a surprisingly unconventional sense of morality, which will be a persistent thread throughout the canon, and a recognizably Gothic sensibility, both of which I'm attributing to a mixture of Doyle's interest in the mode. He had written a few short stories dabbling in the Gothic before this point, and an example of Watson's influence over the narrative, which is supported by several comments Holmes will make about Watson's writing choices throughout the canon. A rhetorical analysis of A Study in Scarlet is immediately problematized by the first line, which presents what we're reading as a reprinting of Watson's journal. However, it will become clear at several points that Watson is doing at least a little editorializing throughout, and the novel's middle section will have him taking quite a severe bit of creative license, bringing his overall reliability into question, at least as far as the facts are concerned. He seems more interested in sentiment. The introduction paints Watson as quite a lonely figure. While serving as a doctor in the British Army, he is shot in the left shoulder nearest to his heart, and eventually becomes so ill that he is shipped back to London, where he wanders aimless and friendless until he resolves that he needs to either leave London or else change his living situation. That same day, he happens to run into an old friend named Stamford, who mentions that he has another acquaintance looking for a roommate. Watson immediately seizes upon the idea of moving in with him, telling Stamford, "If he really wants someone to share in the rooms and the expense, I'm the very man for him. I should prefer having a partner to being alone," so ardently that Stamford gives him a strange look in response, but he agrees to introduce them all the same. It is traditional for a Gothic story to have a moment where the character, consciously or unconsciously, traverses from the ordinary world into the sublime, with all the positive and negative connotations that entails. In Scarlet, that moment comes when Holmes and Watson meet, and Watson finds himself drawn into a new and mysterious world. Holmes is lively and eccentric from the first moment he steps onto the page, equally thrilled about his scientific research and the prospect of moving in with Watson. As they shake hands, Holmes deduces Watson has been in Afghanistan, and later, when Watson asks Stamford about it, Stanford responds that this apparent omniscience is something Holmes applies to everyone he meets, though he doesn't know how he does it. Watson is captivated by this puzzle, and the first chapter ends with the following exchange. "Oh, a mystery, is it?" I cried, rubbing my hands. "This is very piquant. I am much obliged for you to bringing us together. The proper study of mankind is man, you know." "You must study him then," said Stanford as he bade me goodbye. "You'll find him a knotty problem, though. I'll wager he learns more about you than you about him. Goodbye." "Goodbye," I answered as I strolled back to my hotel, considerably interested in my new acquaintance. I highlight this passage for two reasons. One is the use of the word study, which, as you might be able to guess from the title, A Study in Scarlet, will be cropping up at a few key points throughout the novel, and is here directly tied to Watson's initial fascination with Holmes. The second reason I highlight this moment is that this scene shares some similarities with another that happens later, and I'd like to plant the seed now so that you can maybe make the connection before I draw it out explicitly myself. The next portion of the novel is dedicated to John Watson trying and failing to solve the mystery of Sherlock Holmes. He watches Holmes coming and going from their flat, takes note of the strange people he associates with. At one point, he resorts to writing out a list of all of Holmes's strengths and weaknesses before throwing it into the fire in frustration. After taking great pains to describe Holmes in close detail, emphasizing that anyone would be impressed by his appearance and his tall height, his sharp and piercing eyes, the alertness and decision of his features, and most amusingly, his extraordinary delicacy of touch, which Watson notes as he watches him manipulating his fragile philosophical instruments. Watson breaks form to address the reader directly. Oops, a little too far. All right, there we go. "The reader may set me down as a hopeless busybody when I confess how much this man stimulated my curiosity, and how often I endeavored to break through the reticence which he showed on all that concerned himself. Before pronouncing judgment, however, be it remembered how objectless was my life, and how little there was to engage my attention. I had no friends who would call upon me and break the monotony of my daily existence. Under these circumstances, I eagerly hailed the little mystery which hung around my companion, and spent much of my time in endeavoring to unravel it." So from this, we can gather that Watson is aware his behavior around and fascination with Holmes is unusual, enough that he forgoes the charade that this is a private accounting to defend himself to the reader, but not enough that he is willing to edit these things out of his narrative. In fact, from the showing of his hand here, we can assume that this intimate study of Sherlock Holmes is actually quite important to him and the story he hopes to convey, even as he knows it will incite judgment from others. Now, the literal mystery Watson is attempting to solve here could probably be solved at any point with a simple question, but Watson refuses to break the silence, stating at one point that my delicacy prevented me from forcing another man to confide in me, imagining at the time that Holmes had some strong reason for not alluding to it. In context, this is about Holmes's profession, but we might also wonder whether Watson's reticence here is about something more personal, given the delicate nature of broaching certain subjects at this time. Eventually, Holmes tells Watson that he works as a detective. After a demonstration of his abilities, Watson tries to compliment Holmes by comparing him to two of his favorite literary detectives, but Holmes dismisses the comparisons by insulting the writing of both stories, leaving Watson more than a little annoyed. Holmes goes on to lament the state of his profession, stating that he knows he has the ability to make his name famous, if only he had a case worthy of his talent. I don't think it's an accident these two exchanges are placed together. This is a subtle example of Watson asserting his own worldview over Holmes' more rational facade. Holmes here may declare that his work alone will suffice to secure himself a legacy, but Watson knows that won't be enough. To make Sherlock Holmes' name famous, it will take a story and a storyteller. Shortly after, Holmes receives a call to a crime scene and asks Watson to accompany him. Here, the mystery of the novel, outside of Watson's interest in Holmes, begins to take shape, but it would be a mistake to assume that this is where Watson's influence ends. Throughout the case, Watson's guiding hand is fairly obvious once you know where to look for it. As an example, while a reader may come to the novel expecting to feel sympathy for a murder victim, the descriptions of Enoch Drebber discourage the reader from that interpretation of events. Watson describes the corpse as being posed in a malignant and terrible contortion with writhing, unnatural posture. Later in the novel, Watson goes so far as to say that he found it difficult to feel anything but gratitude for him who had removed its owner from the world. though he is quick to add that he recognizes that justice must be done and that depravity of the victim was no condonement in the eyes of the law. As with Watson's acknowledgement that his reader may judge the intensity of his interest in Holmes, he does not allow his awareness of what the law demands to prevent him from sharing his conviction that the murderer of Enoch Drebber was justified. Instead, his descriptions here subtly encourage the reader to feel the same way he does, not directly, but through suggestion. It's a style of rhetorical persuasion you have to be paying careful attention to notice. Watson later gives the reader justification for his and their distaste for Drebber when he and Holmes uncover evidence of his monstrous behavior, including the sexual assault of a young woman, even before we learn the true reasons for Drebber's murder. An innkeeper describes her decision to let Drebber stay under her roof as a sort of deal with the devil, one she wishes she had refused. And in his gratitude for Drebber's killer, Watson again evokes the idea of a morality that is separate from the official law and even popular opinion, a truer law, and hints that higher power may just side with the criminal. So who is that criminal? Dr. John H. Watson is slow to reveal information on that score. The most solid lead on his identity is a note found on the corpse of a man named Stangerson, dated several months back and stating only that J.H. is in Europe. Holmes is able to piece together a basic description of the murderer from details at the scene of the crime, and slowly builds a sketch of his character from further clues they discover as the investigation progresses. Holmes shares his inferences with the police, but later in private explains how he came to his conclusions to Watson after he coaxes Holmes with a bit of flattery. Watson notes the way Holmes blushes when he is complimented, telling the reader, "I had already observed that he was as sensitive to flattery on the score of his art as any girl could be of her beauty," which is an odd point of comparison to make unless he is intentionally evoking the ideas of romance and courtship. On the subject of romance, when the police discover a woman's wedding ring at the scene of the crime, everyone is confused to how it could have gotten there, except for Holmes, who says it simplifies the matter. Holmes explains to Watson that the murderer left the crime scene, but came back and risked capture in an attempt to get that ring. If we have no other way of catching him, we can always bait our line with the ring. I shall have him, Doctor. I must thank you for all of it. I might not have gone but for you, and so missed the finest study I ever came across. A study in Scarlet, eh? Why shouldn't we use a little art jargon? There's the scarlet thread of murder running through the colorless skein of life, and our duty is to unravel it and isolate it and expose every inch of it. Note that the motif of studying makes an appearance here, this time a direct tie to the title, so we know this is especially important. It would seem Holmes has finally found a case he thinks worthy of him, and it hinges around the man J.H. and his fixation on this wedding ring. There's a bit of metafictive humor in Holmes' joke about art jargon, drawing the reader's attention to the constructed nature of what they're reading, suggesting that A Study in Scarlet, the novel, likewise has a scarlet thread running through it, and it is the reader's job to unravel it. At this point, our two keys to that puzzle are John Watson's close study of Holmes and J.H.'s desperation to claim the wedding ring. Holmes is right that J.H. is a skilled opponent. He is able to outwit the police at multiple points, planting a blind that leads them off on the wrong track, and escapes the crime scene when he returns to look for the ring while a police officer watches him by pretending to be drunk. Holmes believes he can best J.H. because he knows his weaknesses, and again, it is emphasized to the reader that J.H. will do anything to get the wedding ring back. But even this is not enough to outmaneuver him. Holmes puts out an advertisement looking for the ring, or saying that he has found the ring, assuming J.H. will arrive to claim it, but is surprised when an old woman comes instead. Holmes failed to account for the fact that J.H. has a friend who is so devoted that he too will risk anything, and it was this friend who came in disguise and successfully made off with the ring. Holmes still manages to work out the killer's identity when the police cannot, but chooses to withhold that information for some further end, dismissing their concern about future victims. There will be no more murders. You can put that consideration out of the question. You have asked me if I know the name of the assassin. I do. The mere knowing of his name is a small thing, however, compared with the power of laying our hands upon him. I have good hopes of winning it through my own arrangements, but it is a thing that needs delicate handling, for we have a shrewd and desperate man to deal with, who is supported, as I have occasion to prove, by another who is as clever as himself. Without meaning to hurt either of your feelings, I'm about to say that I consider these men to be more than a match for the official force, and that is why I have not asked for your assistance. A few moments later, a cabman arrives at the door. Holmes asks him to help load his bags into the cab, then abruptly slaps handcuffs on his wrists, introducing the man as Jefferson Hope, the murderer of both Drebber and Stangerson. When Hope realizes that he's been cornered, he puts up a fierce struggle, and in spite of the fact that it's a 4-on-1 fight, he almost escapes more than once, but is eventually subdued. Holmes then turns to his friends and says that he will now be happy to answer any questions they may have about the case. This is, of course, the crowning moment of any mystery story, the point when all the pieces are at last put into place, and the reader is able to follow the chain of events from beginning to end. But just when the narrative is promising to reach its pinnacle, the chapter ends, and the reader is instead transported to Part 2, The Country of the Saints. In full disclosure, this section is a big part of the reason I wanted to do this talk. I think I might be the only person who can sincerely call this my favorite part of the novel, let alone one of my favorite parts of the entire Holmes canon. Because of where it's placed, I think a lot of readers are caught off guard by this abrupt shift in time and place, especially when this portion of the narrative is much slower to get into the action, a gentle simmer of tension that gradually builds compared to the climax we just departed. So why is it here? I suspect much of the reader's frustration can be alleviated if we view this section, which is eventually revealed to be the backstory of Jefferson Hope, as the fulfillment of what Holmes promised, an answer to our questions. However, Watson's concern is not so much the specifics of the crime, but Hope's motivations for committing it, taking great pains to present the case in such a way that the reader will fully sympathize with Hope and share in Watson's conviction that Hope was right. His many sins served a higher purpose. This portion of the novel is where the allusions to morality in opposition to the official law or popular opinion come to a point. I am not particularly interested in discussing the inaccuracies of Doyle and Watson's depictions of the Mormons here, because I think the fact that they are Mormon is incidental. As Gothic enthusiasts, we know that this mode will often take an ordinary subject and transpose it into a metaphor. Men become monsters and social forces take a more demonic turn. So I posit here that it is not strictly relevant that this story takes place amongst the Mormons of Utah, but that it does not take place in England, so that Watson's assumed reader will not immediately see themselves in this portrayal of the dark aspects of religious control and zealotry. Of course, I'd also argue that there is a reason we're reading about the Mormons of Utah and not a religious sect in some other part of America or some other part of the world. Amongst other matters, the Mormons differ from the Anglican Church in their beliefs on one central issue, one that we already know is at the heart of this story, that of marriage. Part of the difficulty of this section comes from the fact that it is not immediately clear that this is Jefferson Hope's backstory. Instead, we start with two brand new characters, John Ferrier and the young girl he adopts, Lucy Ferrier, as they wander aimless through the wilderness, though the narrators lament that this is a land with no gleam of hope, suggests where this is leading. Even so, I think this introduction is more important than it might first appear, so I will cover these events before we move on to Hope's story. John Ferrier is on the brink of death, weak and emaciated by the time the Mormons stumble across him and his young charge. They offer him shelter and survival, provided he converts to their beliefs. Ferrier wryly remarks that in his position, he would agree under any terms, and joins the Mormons in their travels. After a bit of time to recover, Ferrier shows himself to be a skilled traveler and hunter, winning over those around him and earning himself both respect and material advantage. Practical, keen, and with an iron constitution, he soon becomes one of the most prosperous men in the settlement, with the narrator telling us that in all of Utah, there was no name better known than that of John Ferrier. There is one point, though, where John Ferrier offends the sensibilities of his neighbors. He adamantly refuses to take multiple wives, going so far as to resist taking even one. His neighbors speculate on the reasons, from a lukewarmness in his faith to a loyalty to some long-lost love. But whatever the reason, the narrator tells us, John Ferrier remains strictly celibate, though in all other ways he is an orthodox and straight-walking man. Note that straight did not have the connotations at this time that it does today, but I do find this a deeply amusing coincidence. It is after John Ferrier has established his name and Lucy Ferrier has grown into a young woman that our story begins to progress again. One day, while on an errand for her father, Lucy's horse startles in the middle of a herd of cattle, and she finds herself clinging on for dear life. At that very moment, a kindly voice appears at her elbow, and a tanned hand settles the horse and leads her to safety. This is Jefferson Hope. Lucy invites him to her home so that she and her father can thank him before bidding him goodbye. After echoing her farewell, Hope leaves, his every thought trained on the young woman. The sight of the fair girl, as frank and wholesome as the Sierra breezes, had stirred his volcanic, untamed heart to its depths. When she had vanished from his sight, he realized that a crisis had come in his life. The love which had sprung up in his heart was not the sudden, changeable fancy of a boy, but rather the wild, fierce passion of a man of strong will and imperious temper. He had been accustomed to succeed in all that he undertook. He swore in his heart that he would not fail in this if human effort and human perseverance could render him successful. Hope does indeed succeed in charming both father and daughter with his wit, resourcefulness, and above all, his riveting stories of all he has seen and done in his many adventures. One night, he pulls Lucy aside and asks for her hand in marriage. She blushes and teases him as she agrees to marry him. The two lovers part full of hope for their future. And in another time and place, Jefferson Hope and Lucy Ferrier no doubt would have been happily married for the rest of their lives. But in the country of the saints, the two young lovers never stood a chance. Even a whisper of the upcoming marriage is enough to bring doom upon all of them. The looming threat is not a monster or a ghost, but the church, and its surety that all its beliefs and judgments come directly from the lips of God. The narrator emphasizes that it was a dangerous matter to express an unorthodox opinion in those days, and that those who did so in whispers. Its invisibility and the mystery which was attached to it made this organization doubly terrible. It appeared to be omniscient and omnipotent, and yet was neither seen nor heard. No wonder that men went about in fear and trembling, and that even in the very heart of the wilderness, they dared not whisper the doubts which oppressed them. The very friend to whom you communicated your misgivings might be one of those who came forth at night with fire and sword to exact a terrible reparation. Hence every man feared his neighbor, and none spoke of the things which were nearest his heart. At this stage, you might note the similarities between these descriptions and the reticence Watson demonstrated in establishing his relationship with Holmes much earlier on. But we are not fully primed to dive into those comparisons just yet. But just keep in mind the implications that these descriptions might have if we assume the Mormon Church here is acting as a stand-in for broader examples of religious oppression, other unorthodox beliefs that might only be spoken of in whispers, particularly those that pertain to romance and sexuality. Around this time, the elder comes to Ferrier's home and reminds him of the debt he incurred when the Mormons saved him, accusing him of unfaithfulness. Ferrier responds with frustration that he has done all that could be asked of him, and the elder points out the one exception, his lack of wives. He compares this point to the rumors they have heard of Lucy's engagement to a non-Mormon, a union which the Mormons view as a grievous sin. He tells Ferrier that on this one point, this one issue, his whole faith will be tested. Either Lucy Ferrier marries one of the elder sons, Drebber or Stangerson, or they all die. They are given a time limit of 1 month to come to a decision. John Ferrier immediately requests help from Hope, and the clock ticks down with new warnings placed ominously in and around his home with each day that passes. They are on the cusp of the final day before Hope at last arrives, literally and figuratively, to spirit them away. They make it out of the town and far into the mountains, but the church's influence is far-reaching, and the minute Hope lets his guard down, members of the saints close in on them, killing John Ferrier and whisking Lucy Ferrier back to be married to Enoch Drebber. Knowing there is nothing to be done for her, Hope despairs, before resolving to devote his life to revenge. By the time Hope makes his way back to town, he has undergone a severe transformation, so much so that others find it difficult to recognize him before he gives his name. When Lucy is on her deathbed, Hope storms into Drebber's home and places a tender kiss to her forehead, then takes the wedding ring from her finger, declaring that she will not be buried in it. Then begins the long quest for revenge. He makes multiple attempts that Drebber and Stangerson narrowly evade. When the wait grows longer, the two men hope that their foe has abandoned his quest, but hope never does. After years turn to decades, Drebber and Stangerson flee to Europe, then finally to London. And as we return to the story we left, the narrator makes a baffling aside that on those events, we cannot do better than, to quote the old hunter's account, as duly recorded in Dr. Watson's journal, to which we are already under such obligations. As if this section is not written by Dr. Watson, though it will shortly become clear that it must be. This makes me suspect that Watson wishes to distance himself from this portion of the novel and its more unorthodox suggestions, while still placing those ideas on a higher authority than his own. I find this bit truly fascinating as Watson simultaneously compliments and discounts his own contributions with this move. It's a bit of misdirection he employs often. In the meantime, we follow up on Hope's own account, which is a severely abridged version of the story we just read, meaning either the previous section really was dictated by some omniscient third party, or someone was taking quite a bit of creative license in elaborating on the information Hope here provides. Hope reveals that he has an aneurysm and could die at any moment, and so proposes to give his testimony to the police directly. The police debate over the advisability of allowing Hope to tell his story. They ask Watson if there is any immediate danger, referring to the aneurysm, to which Watson says most certainly there is. But I think by now we can take this as alluding to a second danger here. If Hope is allowed to tell his story, he also has the power to win the hearts of those who hear it. And that's exactly what he does, telling his impromptu audience that if any of them had longed and pined for a thing for years, they would understand his feelings in the moment he had Drebber in his power. We learn here that Hope did not quite murder Drebber. Instead, when they were alone, and after he had revealed himself, Hope had taken out a case with 2 pills from his pocket. "Let the high God judge between us," he tells Drebber. "Choose and eat. There is death in one and life in the other. I shall take what you leave. Let us see if there is justice upon this earth, or if we are ruled by chance." Drebber takes his pill. Hope takes the other. They wait. Drebber dies. Hope survives. He repeats this offer to Stangerson, who attacks Hope rather than risk the pills. Hope stabs him in the heart, but feels no guilt, assured in his conviction that Providence would never have allowed his guilty hand to pick out anything but the poison. "You may consider me a murderer, but I hold that I am just as much an officer of justice as you are." As Hope finishes his story, Watson notes that Hope's narrative and his style of telling it had been so compelling that they had all been completely absorbed in what he had to say. Holmes asks who it was that came to collect the ring on Hope's behalf, and Hope winks and says that while he'll tell his own secrets, he won't betray his friend. Hope dies that same night. Watson describes this as a higher judge taking the matter in hand, and Jefferson Hope meeting a trial where true justice would be executed. Hope is found resting peacefully, with a smile on his face, as though he had been able to, in his dying moments, to look back on a useful life and a work well done. This tells us that if nothing else, Watson, at least, believes that Hope was right. God sided with him. The novel ends not with Hope's story, but with a return to the conversation about Holmes's reputation. In the aftermath of Hope's death, Holmes remarks that the police will be annoyed that this will spoil their commendation. And when Watson points out that the police didn't do much to help catch Hope, Holmes remarks that what you do in this world is of little consequence. Rather, it is what you can make people believe you've done. Sure enough, the newspapers soon tell the story of Gregson and Lestrade's bravery and cleverness. "Didn't I tell you when we started?" cried Sherlock Holmes with a laugh. "That's the result of all our study in Scarlet, to give them a testimonial." Here we have our last key to the study in Scarlet: Watson's interest in Holmes, Hope's fixation on Lucy Ferrier's wedding ring, and the public story of what transpired, as opposed to what is true. Watson tells Holmes he ought to set the record straight, warning him that if you won't, I will for you. Holmes tells him he may do what he likes, and Watson swears that the public will know all the facts in due time, quoting a Latin proverb that translates to something along the lines of, "Though the public hiss at me, I laugh to myself in private as I count the coins in my strongbox." There's an undercurrent of both urgency and assurance to this ending, that this is work Watson plans to take up immediately, and he will not rest until he is successful. And then he proceeds to wait 6 years to publish A Study in Scarlet. Why? An accounting of the facts would have been easy enough to create, but I don't think Watson was writing anything so straightforward as that. So we come to the point that my argument hinges on, one probably more contentious than even a queer reading of the material. I've endeavored to make Watson's influence over the narrative more transparent, because I think once you're paying attention to him, Watson is not being particularly subtle in what he hopes to accomplish. But that's the trick. Somehow he does this in such a way that while it's self-evident that the home stories only exist through his efforts, his agency in the matter is completely disregarded by the reader. We forget that he has chosen to take up his pen to tell a story, and a story with a purpose. We forget that all we read is only true because he says it is. And in fact, the canon will repeatedly show that Watson is a prolific liar, but a liar that you want to trust because he is so unpretentious. It's clear from the very nature of the project he undertakes that Watson highly esteems Holmes and his talents. But just because Watson chooses to focus on Holmes's cleverness, it does not follow that he has none of his own. We see evidence of his intelligence in his handiwork, his ability to tell a story that captivates the reader. But I think even that is not giving him enough credit. If we want to make sense of a study in Scarlet, we need to follow its thread from beginning to end. My idea here is founded on two well-established literary traditions and combining them in a way that is not quite typical, but that I think is the most effective way to unravel this tangled Scarlet skein. The first of these is the idea of the Gothic mirror, or a character within the narrative who expresses the dark or repressed elements of one of the main characters. Perhaps the most well-known example of this is Bertha Mason from Jane Eyre, but other Victorian Gothic works such as Jekyll and Hyde see this same concept playing out within one individual, something that draws on the Victorians' preoccupation with reputation and image, both of which feature in Scarlet. There are at least two characters within Scarlet, I would argue, are narrative mirrors for Dr. John H. Watson. But rather than this being done like in Jane Eyre, where the author implements the mirror unbeknownst to the characters to draw out comparisons for the reader's benefit, I think these parallels are placed here not just by Doyle, but by Watson himself. This leads me to the second element at play here, the metafictive tradition of the nested story, or the play within a play. The closest well-known parallel to what I'm setting up here would be in Hamlet, when Prince Hamlet puts on a play that echoes the events unfolding around him, so that he can see his uncle's reaction to the play and determine whether or not his uncle murdered his father. A Study in Scarlet has its own nested story, one that is obtrusively placed so that it interrupts the novel's climax. And I think its placement makes much more sense if you interpret it as a heightened reimagining of the events we've already read. Watson is reworking and embellishing the facts of the case in order that he might be much more explicit regarding the romantic undercurrent of his story than he can be when he is writing directly about himself. After all, Utah in the 1840s wasn't the only place where it was dangerous to express an unorthodox opinion. Legislation like the Labouchere Amendment, also known as the Blackmailer's Charter, made even a suggestion of a relationship between two men a very dangerous prospect. Again, these two literary elements, while both common on their own, are not usually placed together in this way, though funnily enough, there is a Sherlock Holmes story that explicitly touches on this idea much, much later on in The Three Gables, where a man publicizes the events of his own life with only the names changed to expose a wrong he cannot avenge any other way. If this is what is happening throughout the Holmes canon, this is, on the face of it, quite a reckless thing for Watson to do. And again, the main barrier to adopting this reading is not so much the queer aspect, but that it requires you to go against the main force at work in the story, to challenge the trustworthiness of Watson's apparent inscrutability as a narrator. More than that, you have to believe that he is both clever enough and desperate enough to take this risk, telling just enough of the truth to preserve it, but not enough to get himself caught. Of course, the best way for him to pull off this deception is if you never suspect him to begin with, if you underestimate him, read his story while forgetting that he is the one in control of it. I would argue that he mostly accomplishes this by avoiding talking about himself altogether. Watson is a very difficult character to get a handle on for this reason. Any judgments of his character presented here are based on the way he describes other people rather than himself. People tend to fill in that silence by assuming that because Watson is not as good at solving crimes as Holmes is, he must be a lesser partner, one whom Holmes with out of habit or sentiment. Sorry, just a second. But Watson does include descriptions of himself through others on occasion, mostly through Holmes's remarks. And taking those fragments, I think we can map them to our Gothic metafictive mirrors and trace the story playing out just behind the veil. So once you're looking for this trick, it is not at all subtle. Take, for example, the fact that at the climax of the novel, John Watson interrupts his tale to give you the story of a man named John. Ferrier, not Watson, though I can see why you would be confused. Both are adventurers stricken down with hardship, weak and emaciated, and suntanned. To ensure his safety, John Ferrier goes along with what society expects of him, keeping any objections to himself. And because of his cleverness, charm, and determination, is able to make a great name for himself in due course. Though there is one thing about him that draws suspicion from his neighbors. For some unknown reason, John refuses to marry, appearing to the world strictly celibate. Then comes the story of a man named with the initials J.H. Not J.H. Watson, though it is another very understandable mistake. Jefferson Hope, too, is a tanned adventurer, determined and capable, and above all, desperately romantic. J.H. had been resigned to his lot until the day he met a clever and beautiful stranger. He leaves knowing that his life has been forever changed, and swears that he will not fail if human effort and human perseverance can render him successful. J.H.'s courtship is slow and careful, but his charm and his tales of adventure eventually win the heart of his beloved, who seems especially touched by his flattery. And in another time and place, no doubt they would have been very happily married for the rest of their lives. But in Victorian England, two men in love never stood a chance. No matter that they conform to expectations in every other regard, on this one point, the whole of their faith and their reputations will be tested. And if the truth is discovered, they will fail. So what does Watson do? Unable to marry the man he loves, he formulates a plan, one that takes years to see come to fruition. He takes a gamble, willing to risk the judgment of his readership, believing that he has a higher judge on his side. Watson knows he is clever enough to evade most suspicion, having mastered the art of misdirection and its various forms. If that fails, he is supported by another as clever as himself. And I do love the phrasing of that, the way it flips the traditional understanding of Holmes and Watson's respective standing on its head. It's not so much that Holmes takes a companion of Scarlet, but that the once friendless Watson has finally met his match, the only man who could possibly see through the facade to his true motivations. The unmarried lover all his efforts are for. If Watson cannot marry Holmes in this time and place, he will ensure that some part of them lives beyond it. John Watson will make Sherlock Holmes's name famous, and in the process, ties it indelibly to his own. The work is not without sacrifice, nor without risk, but Watson bravely faces both. The public may hiss at him, but through his carefully crafted rhetorical efforts, Watson stores for himself a treasure that the moth cannot eat nor rust destroy. Providence willing, John Watson may one day look back on work well done, knowing the story of his love for Holmes will survive both of them to see the foundation of a better world. Of course, the process is not without a few trials along the way. The next entry of the Holmes canon, The Sign of the Four, is quite literally a response to the more romanticized elements of Scarlet, with Holmes insisting that the romance must be suppressed. The novel sees Watson meeting and becoming engaged to a Miss Mary Morstan, while Holmes and Watson narrowly avoid arrest by an overzealous inspector and chase down a man named Jonathan Small, an adventurer who will do anything for those he loves, including scatter a treasure in irretrievable pieces rather than letting anyone he deems unworthy lay hold of it. And that's only 2 of 60. The next time you return to the Holmes stories, I encourage you to keep your eyes out for any Johns, Jameses, JHWs, derivatives thereof, or any other doctor or storyteller lurking in the shadows. You may just discover that there's more to the man at the raids than you first thought. And this seemed like the perfect audience to end on a pun with, so thanks for coming to my Red Talk.